In my last video, I covered how I repaired a broken oar blade using G-Flex epoxy. In this video, I'll talk you through the products and process used to refinish my oars, and I'll explain why I varnished only the blade end up to the leathers. Let's start with how they used to look. The oars look as though they've been oiled. It's a nice finish, but I want to give the oars a little more protection than they get from the oil. You can see that they've had a couple of knocks which have put some significant dents in the wood. I've decided to varnish them to give a little more protection against knocks and scrapes. The resins in an oil-based marine varnish will help to give a more durable finish. Varnish is also a sensible choice for oars that have glued joins. These blades are made from oak and spruce glued together. The glued joins need sealing and protection from both water and UV rays. I used epoxy to repair the broken blade, and epoxy should always be protected from the damaging effects of sunlight. I'm not going to varnish the whole oar. I'll varnish the blades and shaft up to the leathers. I'm keeping an oiled finish at the handle end. For me, an oiled handle just feels better than one that's varnished. It feels warmer and smoother than varnish and is less slippery when wet, and it's probably less likely to cause blisters. I'm using a 1-part high-gloss clear varnish by Epifanes, also pronounced Epifanes, which is considered to be one of the best spa varnishes available, famous for its high-gloss retention, UV protection and excellent durability. A spa varnish is composed of much longer polymer chains than other types of varnish, which gives it a flexible finish, allowing it to shrink and swell along with the movement of wood. Spa varnishes are designed to be used on surfaces that flex, like spars and masts. They are less prone to chipping and cracking than other harder types of varnish, but more likely to dent because they are softer. It's safe to apply Epifanes traditional varnish to a previously oiled surface. Epifanes make a wide variety of varnishes and thinners. Make sure you use the thinner that is specifically designed to work with your choice of varnish. I'm using 2 thinners that were designed to be used with Epifanes traditional 1-part spa-type varnish. These are the Epifanes brush thinner for 1-part varnish. I'll be using this to thin the first few coats of varnish, and spray thinner for 1-part varnish. After sanding between coats, I'll be using this for cleaning and degreasing. It's February in the UK, so it's pretty cold in my garage. I bought my oars indoors so that I can varnish them at an optimal room temperature, around 18 to 20 degrees centigrade. At this temperature, the varnish will take 24 hours to dry. The leathers are not as tight as they should be, but that's fine because I want to remove them before I begin to varnish and oil. I mark where I want the varnish to end and begin to degrease and clean with Epifanes spray thinner. My next task is to sand with no finer than 220 grit paper. I'm using 180 grit paper to ensure the varnish adheres well to the bare wood. Always sand in the direction of the grain to avoid scratching the wood. Then I clean again. I apply masking tape where I made the pen mark, then I stir the varnish really well. I carefully measure out the varnish and thinner. The first coat is heavily thinned by 50% to ensure the varnish soaks into the wood. While brushing, I make sure that I work the varnish into the wood grain. Let the varnish fully dry. This took 2 days because my house wasn't very warm at night. Once the varnish has dried, I knock back any raised wood grain and abrade the surface in preparation for applying the second coat. You need to sand each coat to create a good mechanical bond between the layers of varnish. Either sand with 220 grit paper or use a fine grade Scotch-Brite pad. The pad is my preference because it scuffs up the surface without removing too much varnish. Once again, I clean with Epifanes spray thinner before applying the second coat of varnish, which is thinned by 25% with Epifanes brush thinner. Once coat 2 is dry, I sand the surface and clean again before adding coat 3, which is thinned at 15%. I sand and clean between up to 8 coats. From coat 4 onwards, I thin the varnish at only 5%, just to help with flow. I removed the masking tape, then cleaned and degreased the handle ends of the oars with denatured alcohol in preparation for oiling. I'm using Deks Olje D1, a saturating wood oil which feeds the wood to replace lost oils. It drives out moisture and air present in the wood, fills the pores with oil, and enriches and stabilises the wood to provide long-lasting protection. It gives a clear matte finish, enhancing the wood's natural beauty. The oil should be applied wet on wet, so after coating the wood, you need to apply further coats before the previous coat has dried. It normally takes about 15 minutes for the D1 to soak into the wood, but I found it took 45 minutes for it to soak into the wood enough for me to apply a second coat, probably because the wood was already nicely saturated with D1. On this occasion, 2 coats seemed to be enough. Once the varnish had cured for a few days, I put the leathers back on. The high gloss finish really brings out the wood grain, but there's a downside to a high gloss finish. Scuffs and scratches will stand out more than they would on a satin or matte surface. If you decide you don't like such a shiny finish, you can apply a final coat of satin varnish. Alternatively, gently buff over the final coat with a fine Scotch-Brite pad. This will create a soft, natural looking finish, very similar to the way the wood looks when oiled.